Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eli Gilman. I am the Vice President for Operations at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We'd like to thank you all for being here today for today's talk on U.S. China security relations, assessing China and responding to risk. I'd like to especially thank our members and partners and donors without whom events like these would not be possible. If you're not already a member or partner or donor of FPRI, I encourage you to become one. You will see links in the chat box throughout the program, which will give you links to donate to FPRI. With us today is Jacques deLisle, Director of FPRI's Asia Program. He is also the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also the Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at Penn. He'll be joined by Fiona Cunningham, and I'll let Jacques introduce Fiona. Just one final note before we begin. We will have questions and answers from the audience about halfway through the program. Please start putting your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We also have a chat function. You can use that if there are any technical issues throughout the program. All right, Jacques, take it away.
Well, thank you, Eli, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and special thanks to Fiona Cunningham for being our guest in the latest in our series of panels and talks on U.S. China relations in the current period. Fiona is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the George Washington University, but I'm happy to say we've lured her to Penn. She'll be an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania starting July 1, as we hope to see a great deal of her around FPRI, and I look forward to welcoming her formally as a colleague at the university. She's also been a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and has had fellowships and been in residence at Renmin University in Beijing, at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, and the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Her PhD is from MIT, and before that she was educated in both, I assume, political science and definitely law, the first at the University of New South Wales and the latter at the University of Sydney. Her works appear in many of the leading journals in the field, including International Security, Security Studies, and the Texas National Security Review. I'm also delighted to say that she is one of the participants in our project on the future of U.S.-China relations, which we run out of the China Center at Penn with the support of FPRI, among others. And so the essays in that collection are available on the website for the project. I think we'll be putting a link to that in the chat function. So we've got a lot on the plate. U.S.-China security relations are a big topic, and I think it's fair to say an increasingly fraught one. We're in an era when we now routinely describe the relationship as at least tense, possibly rivalrous, maybe adversarial, a little bit confrontational perhaps, maybe even a new Cold War, as some would describe it. But what drives this, of course, is China's growing capabilities and the reality, or at least the perception, of China becoming more assertive, and what that means for U.S. interests and agendas. So there's a bunch of issues here, and on the security side of it, I can't really imagine anybody better to bring into this discussion than Fiona. So let's start with the big question, which is how does China see this situation? What are the sort of threat perceptions and the perceptions of opportunity that China faces in a world where China has become much more formidable, but also has a somewhat soured relationship with the U.S., at least against the baseline of several years ago?
All right, thank you very much to start with to Eli and to Jacques for inviting me to be part of the conversation today. It's a pleasure to meet all of you virtually, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know the community from my new home at Penn in the coming months. So turning to, I think, some of the main sort of challenges from China's perspective, looking at the situation, I'm going to focus on the kind of military and security challenges that China faces. I think there are sort of twofold. One is dealing with local wars on China's periphery. This is kind of the military strategic guideline that the PLA has had for the past 3 decades. So specifically looking at the pacing threat and issue of a contingency over Taiwan. And then the other one being the issue of dealing with great power relations, and in particular, the possibility that the United States could be looking to contain China's rise, and to what degree and with what sort of set of tools. And so I think I will caveat my remarks by saying it's becoming increasingly difficult to get a real-time and nuanced perspective on China's threat perceptions, because it's much more difficult for foreign researchers to be able to access some of those resources than it used to be. But at least a couple of years ago, the way that the PLA would write about some of these challenges, the People's Liberation Army, were that, you know, a preventive war in which the United States tried to stop China's rise using military means was very, very unlikely. But the most likely sort of set of contingencies that China would need to prepare for were local wars on its periphery, and in particular, the prospect that there could be a conflict over Taiwan in which the United States could intervene. So there's sort of, I think, the two main military security challenges that the PRC has been facing, and really thinking about how to prepare for those, and viewing them, I think, very much through the lens of threat, as well as to a lesser degree some opportunity.
So let's pursue a couple of those strands there. So the Taiwan issue, of course, is a perennial source of friction, and certainly very high on the list of what China's military has to worry about, and what the top leadership worries about as a military contingency. So how have you seen shifts in that? I mean, on the one hand, of course, the sense that Taiwan was going to provoke the crisis has come down, say, from the Chen Shui-bian years, when there was talk of things that looked awfully close to independence. We had, you know, a fairly stable situation during Ma Ying-jeou's presidency, but now with Tsai Ing-wen, we've got this, I think, disjunction in a sense, right? In that from the U.S. view, Tsai has been pretty moderate, pretty accommodating on cross-strait issues, and China nonetheless has been ratcheting up the pressure with a lot more military operations, you know, ships and planes going quite near Taiwan, and taking a somewhat tougher tone. So, you know, what's the sense of the Taiwan contingency now? Has that come down some? Has that remained at a lower level despite the cold shoulder towards Tsai on political fronts? And how do you think, and I know it's hard to get this now, but how do you think China is responding to some of the statements from the Biden administration that have said our support for Taiwan is rock solid, and putting Taiwan pretty high on the list, that is the coercion or pressure toward Taiwan, very high on the list in the Biden administration's indictment of what it sees as China's assertive behavior? Is that posture changing the Chinese view of the first of the threats you talked about?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell in some ways what the posture will look like, as opposed to the sort of immediate tactical reactions that you might see in terms of statements as well as actions on the behalf of the Chinese government as well as the People's Liberation Army. I think the difficulty with present cross-strait relations is it's hard to untangle the action-reaction cycle here in some ways. What are, you know, Taiwanese provocations from China's perspective that have led to it to ratchet up its behavior, and what are Taiwanese or US reactions to a perceived ratcheting up of pressure on China's part? But I think it's worthwhile just going back a little bit to look at how the PLA, I think, has thought about dealing with the Taiwan contingency, perhaps since the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, because as you mentioned, Jacques, there are kind of two military objectives the PLA has to think about in dealing with this. One is to stop Taiwan from making steps towards formal independence, and the other is to compel reunification. So there's kind of a positive goal as well as a negative goal. And I think the PLA had a pretty well thought out strategy for the negative goal of how you stop Taiwan from taking steps towards provocations, which involved really trying to come up with ways to keep the United States out of the picture for as long as possible if there was a military contingency, which in some ways would deter Taipei from actually making those provocations in the first place, because they couldn't be sure the US would pay the costs of coming into that conflict. And ways in which China's looked to create those dilemmas include building up its conventional missile force being one of them, and its capabilities to target other things the US values in space, in cyberspace on the homeland, as well as its ability to deny US forces access to the Taiwan Straits through its so-called anti-access area denial capabilities. So there's a thought-out strategy for the keep out, but the compelling reunification piece, I think, is a trickier one to look at in terms of the military implications. And PLA texts for a number of years have written about the need to have an island landing campaign for which basically they would conduct an amphibious invasion, but also looked at some coercive campaigns of bombarding the Taiwanese islands, bombarding US bases in the region, as well as a blockade. So they're the kind of military strategies that have been on the piece. And I'm not, I mean, I think it's too early to tell, but it would not surprise me if the political back and forth that has currently occurred with Tsai Ing-wen's election, as well as the Biden administration, doesn't sort of change the fundamentals of what those campaigns look like and what the PLA is prepared to do. But they may change the political calculations about when is Taiwan making a move towards independence, and when do is there a closing window of opportunity for the PLA to try to effect reunification before the US is able to build up coalitions? There's the sorts of, I think, political questions that are washing around and that are really motivated by the kind of Biden administration and Tsai Ing-wen administration's statements and actions.
And compounded some by the bad case scenarios each side imagines shifting a little bit, right? Much of the I think the U.S. perception of what the PLA might do was really focused on some kind of invasion or near invasion scenario, and now we've got a bunch of gray zone tactics, and where does that coercion become effective without reaching the level of a threat of kinetic conflict? And Beijing's concerns that it's not going to be Chen Shui-bian standing up and declaring a Republic of Taiwan, but it's going to be what Beijing calls creeping or slow or cultural independence. So it's much harder, I think, to find those triggers from either side about where the red lines, or at least the pink fringes of the red lines, might be.
I'll just offer one reaction to that. I think you're absolutely spot on with the kind of gray zone tactics and the increased intrusions into Taiwanese airspace by PLA aircraft, for example, being a pretty prominent manifestation of that in the last 12 months or so. And I think another interesting thing to contemplate there is whether or not these gray zone tactics are about putting pressure on Taiwan, about really knowing where the red lines of armed conflict are and butting right up against them, which is what I think China has managed to do very effectively in the South China Sea, and whether there are other objectives at play there about, normalizing PLA presence around Taiwan's air and littorals in ways that reduces the US's warning and Taiwan's warning if there were actually to be an attack. And I point to just today, Oriana Skylar-Maestra had a piece come out in Foreign Affairs that looks at some of these questions. It's definitely worth taking a look at.
Yeah, so I do want to turn to your second point about great power relations, but we have a question in the Q&A function, which you just touched upon in your answer, which is the South China Sea, which is obviously the area where we've seen a lot of Chinese military activity. We've seen the China Maritime Service be prominent there. We've seen the PLA Navy there. And of course, until fairly recently, people might have said that had passed Taiwan as the most likely context in which the US and China could come to blows.
I think it's a fair question, but I think also there is an interesting question of just what US interests are actually at play in the South China Sea and how much of a cost it would be willing to pay to defend whatever those interests are. And I think that's a debate that has been somewhat playing out in the United States without a clear resolution about exactly what's at stake there. And that is a debate that China in some ways has exploited and found ways in which to isolate the claimant states in its approach to sort of increasing its administrative presence and control over those areas and really normalizing something of a sphere of influence without the US making concerted decisions that this is or is not an interest that it's willing to defend. So I think it's in the PLA's hierarchy of their discussion of the kinds of conflicts China was going to face, at least from a couple of years ago. They classed border disputes as low to medium scale local wars that obviously could escalate into something greater if a great power were to intervene. But certainly in some of my conversations with Chinese experts, I'd say roughly about 5 years ago, they didn't seem to think that a conflagration over the South China Sea would really erupt into a really serious regional war between the United States and China.
Okay, well, let's go with some other questions, but let's move on to your second principal point there, which is great power relations and how the PLA and China more generally perceive that among the two top concerns.
Sure. So I think in this area, so far, the military piece of it has been less than the political piece. And so I think there are a couple of aspects to that. You don't see, for example, China planning for a general preventive war as being one of their most likely contingencies. So, what are the other ways in which the United States might be looking to contain China's rise? And I think threat perception from China's perspective there is that it's happening more in the in the maintenance of presence in the region with US military capabilities. It's happening in cyberspace with the extent to which the United States and its partners have pushed a multi-stakeholder approach to cyber governance rather than one that is more state-based and sovereignty-based, which would be the PRC's preference. So that's another arena in which they see their interests as being infringed upon. Increasingly in the technology space, where China sees itself as being very dependent upon Western technology in ways that gives Western countries levers to coerce it at an appropriate time. So that's another aspect of constraining China's rise. The US alliance system within the region. So the efforts to sort of contain China's rise from their perspective are not necessarily playing out in a, US will start a war on us, but in the, or wage a war against us, but in these sort of other spaces.
So again, surely too early to tell, but one of the sort of whipsaw effects of US policy in the region was we had Trump casting some doubt on the solidity of US alliances and commitment to allies, which I'm sure was noticed among the people you study in China. And then we have Biden swinging very much in the other direction, talking about the importance of allies and friends as force multipliers. How seriously do you think those changes are read as being, really transformative rather than, just another bit of surface noise in Chinese thinking about the contingencies of great power conflict with the US?
Well, I think that China has frequently referred to the US alliance system within East Asia as outdated Cold War thinking, is a kind of common phrase. And I think it's instructive actually to go back before Trump and have a look at how Chinese experts perceived US alliances. I noticed in some of my fieldwork in the sort of mid-2010s some interesting shifts within Chinese perceptions, initially being that the US wouldn't necessarily go to war with China to defend the interests of some of its allies, to being the US would go to war to protect the interests of some of its allies within the region, but not nuclear war. That was a sort of gradation that took place, I think, roughly around the 2014 to 2016 period of time. So certainly there was already a perception that the US was shoring up its alliances in that space, but just how much of a cost the US is willing to pay to look after the interests of its allies, I think, is an open question from China's perspective. When discussing the South China Sea, some research that I'd done with Taylor Fravel at MIT on the nuclear piece and the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. China relations. Often analysts would say, look, if it's a South China Sea type of contingency, the United States can find ways to support its allies, but not necessarily end up in a conflict with China over those interests. So it can sort of find a middle way of rhetorically providing support without necessarily needing to put that kind of skin in the game. But also notice some variation in the US's commitment to, or not so much commitment, I guess, but to the nature of its alliance relationships. Some allies were very prudent about not creating conflicts that could escalate into military conflagrations bringing in the United States, while others were more risk acceptant. And Japan sometimes was put in the risk acceptant category and sometimes not put in the risk acceptant category. So there's a bit of variation, I think, in how Chinese analysts were viewing the agency of allies. And I think that's an important one for us to take into account on this side of the Pacific, is that China's also watching what US allies are doing and how they're thinking about the likelihood of US intervention on their part and their interests in that way.
Okay, those last remarks speak to one of the questions we have in the chat, which is about Japan's response as factoring into China's activities surrounding Taiwan and the South China Sea. So I may just press that one step further, which is that we have seen Japan recently start sounding a little more pro-Taiwan, as it were, a little more engaged. And there are, of course, links that one can emphasize or de-emphasize between the South China Sea issue and the East China Sea issue. And of course, Japan has done some things to link that. Do those kinds of developments change the analysis any, or are these just kind of baked into Chinese assessments, or are they examples of what you're talking about, where Japan gets put sometimes in the risk accepting category and sometimes not?
Jacques, your question is putting me back to some time spent in the metro cars of the Beijing subway at the time that Japan had, I'm trying to remember exactly what the security reforms were, but essentially had made it easier for the Japanese self-defense forces to acquire more offensive capabilities. Widely reported on the subway cars right alongside the PLA's displays of military strength in its most recent parade. So Japan, I think, definitely garners a degree of public attention as well within China. I think, you know, the East China Sea and South China Sea sort of connection, I hesitate to say too much because it's not my area of direct expertise, but I would guess that Chinese analysts draw a line between the clear strength of the U.S.-Japan security alliance and the clear statements that were provided on behalf of the United States about how it would think about East China Sea conflicts and those that occur within the South China Sea and the differences in those kinds of alliances. In terms of Japanese statements about Taiwan, I mean, this is an interesting question to consider from Australia's perspective too, because it's certainly said a couple of things about Taiwan recently that that are unprecedented, I guess, in the security dialogue. But my sense is that it probably doesn't change Chinese calculations dramatically, because they would make assumptions that US regional bases would be used in any Taiwan contingency regardless. The implications are likely to be more, I think, political about their calculations of the costs of actually starting a conflict and what degree of alliance cohesion the United States could bring to a future contingency involving Taiwan if the PRC provoked it, or was seen to provoke it.
So I do want to move on to a couple of other topics, but we've got some more a list of countries. You see, you open the door by mentioning Taiwan as whatever we want to call it. I'm not going to commit the John Cena mistake of labeling it, or the U.S. And of course, now we've touched upon Japan, the rival claimant states in South China Sea. But we have questions about other countries too. You said that when you were doing your research, the border war contingencies were relatively low, but of course we just saw at least a skirmish with India, and so the questioner asks how much India is a major or growing concern for China's military planners and security calculations.
I think it's an excellent question. It's a very difficult one to answer, in part because it's quite unusual for, or certainly in the past was quite unusual for, Chinese strategists to acknowledge that India's military power in particular was a challenge for China to be dealing with. I think they're aware of it, but for whatever reason don't necessarily acknowledge the possibility of an Indian threat. And some other scholars have written that this is in part because China doesn't necessarily wish to give India the status boost of treating it as an equal in that sense. And that's certainly true, I think, in the nuclear relationship, where obviously India and Russia, as well as the United States, all factor into China's calculations about what nuclear weapons it needs. But very rarely would Chinese analysts explicitly state that Indian nuclear weapons were an important driving force in the force structure. But then, of course, you could look at where China was basing its nuclear weapons and tell quite a different story, because there certainly are some that are that bring major Indian cities within range. The border war contingency, I just want to clarify, is classed by the PLA as a low to medium intensity local war. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's low probability, but just there is a sense that it is not going to escalate into a high intensity war, and it is not the kind of pacing threat that the PLA is concerned about, the way that a high intensity local war over Taiwan would be, or in a more distant but more threatening sense, a preventive general war to stop China's rise.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. And of course, yes, the Taiwan contingency, as it draws the U.S. in, that was one of the concerns about some South China Seas contingencies. And of course, India and Russia are the two bordering states, if we count only land borders, where border issues could become, great power conflicts. So talking about a not so great power that has been a focus of U.S. China security interactions over the years, and that is the one place where the U.S. and the People's Republic have actually fought a war with one another, the Korean Peninsula, particularly North Korea. Where does that figure into PLA thinking? Obviously, a far-fetched, low probability, but would be a high-level problem if the U.S. were to, as it sometimes seems to get to the brink of, take actions to take out North Korean nuclear facilities and things of that ilk. So how large do Korean Peninsula contingencies figure in Chinese security thinking and PLA thinking?
So interestingly enough, the border kind of contingencies bucket, I guess, of conflict contingencies also includes sealing off the border against instability from a neighboring country. And you can extrapolate from that, which country PLA strategists might have in mind when they're talking about that. I think that
it's not going to be Mongolia.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think the concerns from a Korean Peninsula contingency, I think they're very much seen through the lens of great power kind of relations and the geopolitics of US presence on the Korean Peninsula and the alliances of South Korea, more than the nuclear threat. So there's an important difference, I think, in the key lenses, if you like, that the US and China bring to thinking about North Korean contingencies. But I think there is concern about instability across the border. There's concern about the possibility of nuclear accidents. I think that was an interesting one that came up in some discussions that the US and China have had in the context of Track 1.5 dialogues about nuclear threats. Is the nuclear testing on the border with North Korea is a problem for the bordering Chinese states. So it's a nuisance, but I think the bigger issue through which China views that problem is what it means for the kind of future of US alliances and US presence on its periphery, as opposed to a direct threat from the DPRK per se.
Okay, one last country, which I will throw in for obvious reasons, is one of our questioners. We've done 3/4 of the Quad, but let's get to the fourth member of the Quad, from which you hail originally. The questioner asks, Australia has been at the front of China's wrath. Has the United States been strong enough to support Australia? And what is the feeling in Australia towards China? But okay, I'll let that stand. Response?
So having lived in the United States now for, I think, nearly 9 years, it is trickier for me to speak with a very holistic perspective on what the Australian general population, as well as the defense and security policy community, is sort of thinking. But some poll results from actually a former employer of mine, the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney, has suggested that Chinese views of favorability towards China have plummeted in recent years. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, has been a pretty significant degree of economic punishment that's been meted out towards Australia in the last 12 months, ostensibly triggered by the Australian government's call for an independent inquiry into the coronavirus outbreak. But I think a lot of analysts suspect it's more bound up with Australia's forward-leaning approach to dealing with what it perceives as foreign interference within its domestic political affairs coming from the PRC. So I think from Australia's perspective, it's definitely gone from a situation of seeing China as an economic opportunity with which Australia had some differences to a geopolitical challenge. I would say for at least the last 10 years, there's been keen awareness within Australia, I'd say earlier than the United States, actually, about just how much of a challenge China posed to the future regional and global order, to being a much more direct threat in recent years. And you can see this in some of the Australian government's documents. The Defence Strategic Update last year indicated that Australia no longer has, I think, 5 years before of warning time before we would need to think about planning for a conflict in the region. So if that gives you a sense of how the threat perceptions have changed. In terms of what the United States has been doing to support Australia, I will punt on that question simply because I'm not qualified to answer that, and my hunch is that allies always ask for more support than they probably need, and that is reasonable to ask from their senior allies, but has always been a pretty concerted effort on the part of Australia to emphasize how valuable its relationship is with the United States. So I think the public signaling of alliance solidarity and the perennial anxiety that allies have to ask for too much support can make it quite difficult actually to judge whether the US is or is not doing enough to support Australia from the perspective of Canberra.
And of course, many of these moves, including the Quad, are read in China, or at least officially read in China, as being anti-China alignments of one sort or another, right? Then sort of the Biden agenda. And so the question is how seriously China would take those things. And I suspect we probably just don't know yet. So I guess that leads to a somewhat related, broader question. Then I want to turn to some other things, which is we get a lot of rhetoric from China about the insidious agenda of the U.S. to encircle China, to contain China, to establish the Quad, to use the force multiplier effect of the allies Biden is pursuing and all of that. Do those signal really a growing concern, or is this just the kind of pushback that's part of the diplomacy or rhetoric surrounding security affairs?
I can speculate on this, and my hunch would be that it's actually genuine on the part of the PRC, that they see a lot of these actions as being sort of, designed to contain China's rise, as opposed to perhaps attributing the desire for deeper cooperation among countries in the Quad as being motivated by other things, other ways in which other kinds of security challenges they might have, other economic linkages that they wish to pursue. I think China does have a tendency to see itself as at the center of a lot of diplomatic and military initiatives that it may not actually be at the center of in terms of motivating other countries to engage in. I think that's fairly natural for a rising power. It's fairly natural in international relations to read a degree of intentionality and threat to oneself into things that are not necessarily that way. And of course, there are, I think, sections of any one country that, let's take the Quad, for example, that would push engagement with the Quad from quite an explicit motivation of countering China, but then they have to bring a coalition along with them that doesn't necessarily share those motivations. And so, if you're sitting in China, you can look at those decisions and really focus on the motivations of people who are trying to contain China and ignore the motivations of those at the subnational level who have other, different reasons to engage in that kind of deeper cooperation.
So we've covered a lot of ground in security issues here, and much of it has been sort of implicitly in the context of what we would consider conventional conflict scenarios. But of course, that's not the only domain, and you write about the other domains too. So I'd like to explore two of those in turn. First, the nuclear option, as it were, the nuclear realm, where of course China is, along with the U.S., one of a handful of full-fledged nuclear powers. So tell us a bit about how you see China's nuclear policy and its attempt to modernize its nuclear forces. What are the implications of that for U.S.-China security relations? And then we'll turn from nuclear to cyberspace. But let's talk about nuclear first.
It's my favorite topic. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, Jacques. So I think the nuclear policies received a lot of attention in the US and the Western media in recent years, in part because the previous administration made a very big effort to bring China's nuclear modernization efforts to the fore, to try to think about nuclear arms control in a trilateral sense with China, as well as the US's usual partner of Russia. Whether that I think were both genuine security concerns that drove those actions, as well as some opportunistic ways in which the nuclear issue was used to both beat up on China, I guess, as well as to complicate arms control with Russia. But to take a step back, what does China's nuclear strategy look like? Because I think that the attention it's received over the last 12 months doesn't necessarily appreciate the pretty low, modest base from which China's nuclear arsenal modernization is working. Unlike the United States and Russia, China has adhered to a no first use policy, its official declaratory policy since 1964. Of course, countries can always change their plans about when they would use nuclear weapons in the heat of conflict. But what's interesting with China's no first use policy is that it seems to have really influenced the way in which China's nuclear forces have been structured. And one of the, I think, key aspects of that has been that the size of the force has been very small. Last year, the Pentagon estimated that the nuclear force was in the low 200s. And depending upon how you count US deployed nuclear warheads, it's somewhere between, an eighth or a tenth of what the US has deployed, not even in terms of the overall stockpile. So small numbers, I think, is a second kind of key feature of China's nuclear strategy, alongside this pledge that it would only use nuclear weapons if attacked first by another country with nuclear weapons. The third, I think, enduring thread of China's nuclear policy has been centralized control. So the Chinese Communist Party, and its civilian leaders have always exercised a very strong degree of control over both nuclear strategy as well as the use and alerting of the nuclear force. So they're the kind of three tenets from which we're working. And there are a couple of things that have occurred in recent years in terms of China's nuclear modernization that I think have raised concerns about where the nuclear strategy is going, in particular because they make it easier for China to threaten to use nuclear weapons in a broader array of circumstances than it might have in the past. In particular, I think most folks are concerned about the possibility that China could switch to threatening to use nuclear weapons in any given conventional conflict as a way of, accelerating its ability to achieve its aims. So the things that are of concern are an increase in the numbers. The US government has estimated the size of the nuclear stockpile is going to double in coming years. It's fielding a triad of delivery systems, so not just missiles that drive around in the Chinese hinterland, but also a bomber force and a submarine force capable of delivering nuclear weapons for the first time. That it's increasing the alert status, so the readiness of the force, how quickly it can launch, and also deploying some capabilities that have both some missiles that can basically deliver both conventional as well as nuclear warheads. And there's an issue there that, if you have one system that carries both of these two things and you're trying to destroy the conventional version of it in a legitimate role of a conflict, you might make a mistake and end up attacking a nuclear capability instead, and thereby triggering nuclear conflict. So that's kind of the modernization trajectory. As I mentioned, I think the two things that really concern people are that they create more options for China to threaten to use its nuclear weapons first, so would signal a change in how it employs nuclear weapons. But I would suggest that there are other reasons China might have engaged in this kind of modernization. A lot of it precedes decisions that Xi Jinping might have made, so it's not a Xi Jinping strategy. But it's worthwhile looking at some of the decisions, for example, the US was making about missile defense in the Obama administration that Chinese analysts quite explicitly said at the time were going to change the way that the nuclear force needed to look to make sure China could retaliate for any future nuclear strike and thereby deter the use of nuclear weapons.
So in both the conventional capability story and the nuclear story, you're telling us about an acquisition of greater and in some ways more varied capabilities by China. And so I guess I want to put to you the sort of two different thumbnail versions of what this all means. So one view, of course, is that if you've got two relatively matched superpower, near superpower, both of them nuclear, that's a great force for stability because the risks of conflict are just too high under these circumstances. On the other hand, one can also see in your story a suggestion that maybe the distance between the rungs on the escalation ladder get a little shorter. And so we could see ourselves spiraling into a worsening conflict. So which of those scenarios do you buy more and why?
That is a really, really tricky question, Jacques, because I think both of those two things are true at the same time, that when you have greater and more varied capabilities, then, and I should clarify, are you asking in the context of nuclear weapons or across the whole nuclear conventional spectrum?
Well, I think both. I had in mind the risk that you would escalate within either spectrum or across the threshold from one to the other. So yeah, whichever.
I think that both of those 2 points can be true, that having more varied capabilities and more of them can make the cost of conflict too high, and they can also make it easier to escalate. And there is a political decision that both the United States and China have to make about the point at which costs become too high and where they're willing to escalate up until that point. And neither of the two countries, I think, probably haven't decided ex ante of a conflict where exactly the costs get too high on that conflict escalation ladder, and certainly haven't signaled to each other where that threshold lies, so that you would be able to avoid spilling over into a more destructive conflict than either country wants to end up being involved in. So I think both of those two things are true at the same time, that having more and more varied options makes escalation more easy, but also more dangerous. And you can exploit those changes up to a point, and they become very problematic and very destructive above that point. And so it's really a question of working out, how much conflict is too much conflict, how much destruction is too much destruction, and coming up with a way to signal that, if you're, of course, looking to prevent further escalation. But if you're not, then it's to exploit that possibility that things might keep on getting very destructive.
Okay, we have something of a follow-up in the Q&A box here, which asks, does the lack of a definitive second strike nuclear capability from China increase the risk of a conflict between China?
So I would probably push back against the contention that China doesn't have a secure second strike capability. I think it has a thin one. It certainly has less of a capability than a country like Russia does, with a very large and diverse nuclear arsenal. But China's nuclear arsenal is mobile on trucks on the Chinese hinterland. They're able to hide, and they're by all intents, with current technology, it's very difficult to find and track those missiles so that you could destroy them before they're launched. So, and on top of that, you have a submarine-based capability, and you also have an air leg that is coming online. Both of those are a little bit less survivable, but I would not have a huge amount of confidence based on open sources saying to a US decision maker that they could disregard China's nuclear arsenal because it doesn't have a second strike. So, I think I would push back against that sort of judgment, pushing the question, but to sort of get at the logic of, well, does not having a second strike capability make China less likely, or make conflict less likely or more likely? I think that depends on whether, or I think it would create incentives for China to be using its nuclear weapons before it's disarmed, so it could potentially make it more likely. That's at least how the kind of Cold War logic of nuclear deterrence and secure second strike dynamics sort of played out. That, you know, if you could disarm your adversary first, then you would have an advantage in a conflict, but you end up with a never-ending spiral going forward where each country has incentives to use their nuclear weapons as early as possible to make sure they don't lose that ability, and thereby find themselves in an untenable political situation of not being able to deter a nuclear strike later on in a conflict.
So we have one more question from the audience in the nuclear realm, which is, what about Japan? That is, if we reach a situation where Japan is less confident in U.S. backing, whether it's because of the secular decline in U.S. capability relative to China, or whether it's because the proof of concept from the Trump administration questioning not so much the alliance with Japan, but other alliances. But for whatever reason, U.S. capacity or U.S. will is in doubt, and Japan decides to do something that everybody agrees it could do, which is develop nuclear weapons. There are political barriers to that, of course, but technologically, it certainly wouldn't be much of a challenge. How would that change China's strategic calculus? How would it change its view of the threats in its environment?
I think that is an excellent and a very challenging question. The short answer is that I don't know. I can speculate a little bit based on some conversations that I've had in the past, suggesting that a nuclearized Japan would force China certainly to carefully scrutinize its existing nuclear strategy and think about what it might need to do to ensure its security against Japan. So I think in some ways the answer really would depend upon how Japan thought about using its nuclear weapons, whether it had it as an insurance policy for Japanese survival from a conventional invasion or a nuclear attack from China, or whether Japan would be looking to use these weapons first to put pressure on some other conventional contingency that was changing the status quo or was compelling changes in Chinese behavior that they didn't otherwise want to do. So depends a little bit on what Japan does, but I think it would definitely change China's security environment quite significantly. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, let's shift to a very different realm, cyberspace, which obviously is very much part of PLA thinking and US thinking and other thinking on the future of conflict. Everything from cyber attacks to the use of cyber mechanisms to achieve political ends in what we might call the sort of virtual gray zone. So how do you see China as seeing the threats and opportunities in cyberspace, and particularly the role of the PLA in that space?
I think China perceives cyberspace as posing both threats and opportunities, and I don't think it's controversial in that way. That's how most countries, I think, see this as both a terrific opportunity for people-to-people connections, for government service delivery, for, in China's case in particular, economic development, even for social control. It creates all of those kinds of opportunities at the macro level. On the other hand, I think China has perceived a proliferating set of threats in cyberspace over the last, I'd say, about 10 years. Starting with in the military sphere, I think China watched on with great interest and some trepidation as the United States set up U.S. Cyber Command, watched Russia using cyber attacks in the Russia-Georgia war. So they perceive threats in the military domain and during conflict for the way that cyber attacks could affect Chinese interests. One of the, I think, most serious threats that China perceives that perhaps sets it out from other countries is to social stability and the ability of the internet to challenge the role of the rule of the party and to challenge its control over the information space within China. They see threats from, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but reliance upon foreign produced information communications technology products. And I think that those threat perceptions have played out with the ZTE and Huawei bans in recent years. Increasingly, they see threats from critical infrastructure disruptions within China, something that anyone who is trying to drive up and down the East Coast in the last couple of weeks would have experienced with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack from both state actors as well as from cybercrime. So if you open a bank account in China, you have to sign a number of forms basically saying that you understand the risks of online banking, for example, and identity theft. So a whole suite of threats to deal with in cyberspace. Where does the PLA fit in with that? Well, I think initially in the early 2000s, the PLA saw cyberspace and in particular cyber attacks as an opportunity to coerce a more sophisticated military and a more sophisticated economy like the United States through things like critical infrastructure attacks or attacks on the US command and control military systems. But as the country itself has come to depend more on cyberspace over the years, it's sort of built a glass house around the PLA's more forward-leaning approach to using cyberspace to achieve its interests. And it has had to start to think about two things. One is how you actually defend all of China's varied interests in cyberspace and what the division of labor between civilian and military agencies should be. But secondly, if you do start using cyber attacks, what can you expect to come back in terms of cyber attacks in retaliation on your own capabilities? And if you can't protect them properly, then adjusting how willing you are to use those tools to make sure that the punishment you receive back is worth whatever goals you achieve by using those tools in the first place.
Okay, great. We're starting to get close to the end of our time here, but I want to get a couple more things on the table. We've touched upon this in several questions, but let me ask you it a little more pointedly or systematically. How do you see, or how do you see China as seeing the risks of escalation? That is, we do have a situation where we've got lots of tensions, lots of crises, lots of conflicts. But what's your sort of nightmare scenario for how we get into a great power conflict here, and what can or should either side do to mitigate that risk?
I think that what concerns me most is that there is a fairly systematic inattention to what I'd call inadvertent escalation risks within China. And so this is the idea that by conducting some sort of routine operation, you deliberately have effects on something that matters to another country, and they read it as being intending to do something else. So that's a very abstract way of putting it. So I'll put it in slightly more concrete terms. If you think about conducting cyber operations, in order to do that, you often need to do preparation by hacking into your adversaries' computer networks long before you actually end up wanting to execute any sort of an attack. That hacking in process looks very similar from the target's perspective to a similar sort of hack, which is just for the purposes of espionage. So let's say China decides that it wants to know what US military command and control networks are doing in a future operation so that they can get a sense of, is the US looking to attack us? And the United States were to discover that intrusion in the midst of some sort of a US China crisis, and then couldn't be sure whether or not the intent behind China's presence in its computer networks was to attack or for espionage, and therefore might respond with attacks in cyberspace or other such measures that end up escalating the conflict. And scholars have also talked about this possibility in the nuclear domain, that by conducting conventional operations, you can inadvertently end up degrading your adversary's nuclear capabilities. And I think that's the kind of set of scenarios that worry me the most, both from a crisis to a conflict in that kind of cyber scenario that I just described, as well as in the conventional conflict to nuclear conflict kind of scenario, in part because if one isn't aware that if you're not aware that your own operations could be perceived in a certain way by your adversary, then you maybe won't take that risk into account when you decide to conduct those operations. So when China authorizes a hack into US systems, if it doesn't think about how the US might misperceive that in a crisis, it may go ahead and authorize something without thinking about those consequences. So that's probably the sort of scenario that worries me the most. I think from China's perspective, there is a lot more attention to deliberate escalation risks. So when you actually have an incentive to use more force to start a conflict out of a crisis, or to escalate what's otherwise a more limited conflict into something that's bigger. I think there's a lot more attention to that, and in some ways a lot of confidence on the part of the PLA that there are ways in which you can execute a conventional conflict that prevents it from escalating further. By contrast, they're a lot more pessimistic that once you use a nuclear weapon, you can, exchange a nuclear weapon or two and then end the conflict. So there are sort of interesting differences and blind spots in Chinese thinking about some of these escalation risks. On the other hand, the US pays a lot of attention to these things, but there may indeed be escalation risks that are blind spots for us in the community over here as well. So I by no means mean to suggest that that we have everything worked out.
Well, given the scenario of inadvertent conflict and inadvertent escalation that you point to, the obvious prescriptions for that are a degree of transparency, a degree of mutual understanding of what's going on, some better communication. This doesn't seem like a terribly hopeful moment for that. The level of distrust is significant, and some contacts that were there are no longer so easy to do. Are we at risk of being in a worse position, at greater risk of conflict, because we can't really see what one another is doing as much, whether it be the kind of research work that you and others do, or whether it be the kind of transparency about military doctrine and planning and all that. How dangerous is that in terms of increasing the likelihood of the scenario you're talking about?
It's difficult to sort of judge what the magnitude of the difference is compared to complete transparency, because I think we've never had a sense of what that might look like from the PRC. The PRC has always been very concerned that revealing too much information about its military plans and capabilities was going to increase or would create more opportunities for the United States and other countries to exploit those weaknesses. So without knowing what the counterfactual is there, it's difficult to know how much more dangerous things become. But I think certainly more information is better, if only because it helps decision makers and their staff in both sides of the Pacific, and indeed in allied countries as well, to really think through what are the possibilities. And if I were to put my hat on thinking like a Chinese strategist or a Chinese decision maker, what would this operation look like to me? So it's that almost the red teaming or the strategic empathy that you get from having a little bit more contact. One of the other things I think that the Biden administration is currently pursuing is better communications, crisis communications between the United States and China. There have been a couple of stories about this possibility being pursued, and it's a common prescription for dealing with these kinds of inadvertent escalation risks. If Cyber Command can pick up the phone to the Strategic Support Force and say, hey, what is this? Then perhaps there's less of a chance that that you will end up with the US or China misreading each other's behavior in cyberspace. And how much of a difference that makes really depends upon the quality of communication once both sides pick up the phone and start talking. And I think that's an issue that is further down the line, but is another one that has to be tackled for those kinds of inadvertent escalation risks to be mitigated.
And I think that's a great note to close out much of our discussion on. I think it actually loops back to one of our first points, which is the extent to which the relationship looks a bit like a new Cold War. In many ways, that's of course exaggerated. The US and China remain linked and connected and open in ways that the Soviet Union and the United States were not at the height of the Cold War. But two pieces that have been missing, robust arms control negotiations, something I'd hoped we'd be able to get to, but didn't have time for, and crisis management mechanisms, which have been quite thin compared to what we saw at least in parts of the US-Soviet Cold War. Well, there were a bunch of other things on the table I would have liked to have time to get to. There were questions about China's role in Africa and Latin America, what that does to affect the security relationships between the US and China. What about military dimensions of China's behavior in yet another realm, outer space rather than cyberspace? So we'll have to have you back to talk about those and other things. Obviously, we could go on for a lot longer than we have, but we do agree to keep these things to more or less an hour. But it's been a terrifically rich discussion. As Fiona said, more information is better than less. We certainly believe in that. And we thank you for providing the information and the analysis for our session today. And I'll just invite everyone again to support FPRI, become a member, make a donation, and also tune in for other events. We've got a jam-packed week next week of FPRI events, including Mitchell Orenstein talking about his new book, and we'll have other Asia program scheduling and sessions ahead too. Thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you, Fiona Cunningham, future colleague at Penn and hope at FPRI as well. Take care, everyone.